So welcome to Protecting a Student's Right to Read in a Hyper-Partisan Environment. Jamie Gregory is going to be our presenter today. She is a national board certified teacher in library media, working as the upper school librarian and journalism newspaper teacher at Christ Church Episcopal School in Greenville, South Carolina. She served as the 2019-2020 chair of the South Carolina Book Awards program, a judge for the 2021 Young Adult Library Services Association's William C. Morris YA Debut Award, and is a 3-year blogger for the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. She is the recipient of the 2021 Media Literacy Teacher Award from the National Association for Media Literacy Education. And so we are just so excited and honored to have her speak with us today. And we are really looking forward to, Jamie, to what you have to share with us. And so feel free to jump in and get us started.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. I am excited to be here with everybody, even though it's not such a great topic. So hopefully we can use this time to really lean on each other and remind ourselves that we're not alone. And there are lots of people and organizations out here to support us. So let me see if I can share my screen. Is that we can see? Okay, great. So yes, as you know, our presentation tonight is about protecting a student's right to read in a hyper-partisan environment. So to begin, I wanted to ask you to imagine that the book censors get their wish, that school libraries and school classrooms are stripped of any book or teaching material, which references, alludes to, or explicitly mentions anything about race or sexuality. So we imagine that. And then imagine this: George Floyd's daughter walks into a school where she's told that studying police brutality causes too much division and is inappropriate. So this is the situation that unfortunately a lot of our students are finding themselves in, that their lived experiences are not being honored, and what they're actually going through in their everyday lives, we're calling that divisive and inappropriate. And so we have a lot of situations that we can share and analyze together and talk about what can we do as school librarians. So we are focusing tonight on hyper-partisanship that is currently impacting students' rights in South Carolina. We do have a narrow focus on our state tonight, simply because of time constraints. And the situation is ever evolving, as we all know. It is kind of difficult to keep up. So just be aware of that. And by hyper-partisan, we mean partisanship that's not our regular, debate that's fueled by we just have different ideas and different opinions. So the word hyper, we mean fueled by extreme partisanship. So we're looking at extremism, anything that's sharply polarizing, extreme bias, and clear ideological favoritism. And we'll talk about we're going to talk about what's happening in South Carolina that clearly indicates that hyper-partisanship is at work at this time. And, we're dealing with a lot in school libraries and public libraries. We're dealing with building level administrators, school boards, parents, superintendents, and these people often are not knowledgeable about our profession and the history of librarianship in terms of the First Amendment. And so what we want to remind ourselves tonight is what maybe some people are missing because they don't have this background, that ultimately libraries do not guarantee that patrons will not encounter ideas with which they disagree, which make them uncomfortable, or which may be controversial. There's no way anyone could ever guarantee that in a democracy. So what we're going to do first, if I can get my slide to go. Okay, here we go. First of all, we'll just talk about a little bit of context. Why now? Why is this blowing up now? We'll look at examples in the state of South Carolina. So again, please be sure to check your own state's resources for additional resources. Then we're going to go into kind of refreshing ourselves. What is the foundational knowledge that we should all have as librarians? We're going to look at very important court cases that guide what we do, and also what is in our National School Library Standards and from ALA. And then I'm going to share with you some things I've done in the classroom and in the school library to help educate people about all of these issues. So why now? I'm sure you can remember when Obama first became president. I was a classroom English teacher, and he was giving a speech to students, directed towards students about education. And we already had some hyper-partisanship going on even back then. So this is 2009. And it was very normal for a president to give a speech to students about education, encouraging them, the importance of it. And I remember at my school where I used to teach, we were going to show that speech in our homeroom classes. But then it became such an issue of parents complaining that instead of us showing the speech to all of the students, and if they didn't want to watch it, they could just go somewhere else, it became, we're not going to show it, but if you want to watch it, you could go to the auditorium. And that made me upset for a number of reasons, I'm sure you can guess. And so I remember being very frustrated and getting permission to leave during the school day to go pick up my son, who was in elementary school. And I took him home so he could watch it. And then we went back to school simply out of the principle of the censorship that was going on, simply because of parent complaints. So hyperpartisanship isn't anything new, but I have heard a lot of people argue that our current situation is different. So of course, a lot of this started with the 2016 presidential election, with all of the new kind of widespread fears of fake news and manipulation and indoctrination. And of course, that is carried through and is even stronger today. Of course, the summer of 2020 with racial unrest, with protests and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And I've heard a lot of people argue this point also, that Nancy Jo Lambert from the Freedom Organization in Texas, she has said this too, that some people have kind of expected a little bit of a pushback. The past several years, we have seen an increased focus in education on diversity, equity, and inclusion, that this is kind of just a natural pushback that was kind of going to happen. And then of course, COVID-19, social media and disinformation spreading like wildfire. So all of these things kind of have come together to create a perfect storm of all of this new censorship that we're seeing across the nation. So the first case study that we're going to look at in South Carolina, we had a case of censorship of the resource CNN 10. This was in Horry County, South Carolina. The reporter, David Weissman of the Sun News, published a story about this. And the story basically said that instructors in this county were instructed not to use CNN 10. And then after it got some media attention, the administration said, no, we did not tell people they could not use this in the classroom as a resource. But this reporter, through a FOIA request, he basically figured through all the emails he read that it was clear, the instructors clearly thought that this was a directive that they should not use CNN 10 as an instructional resource in their classrooms. And of course, we know that just the word CNN triggers a lot of reactions in a lot of people. But as educators, we know that CNN is a reputable news media outlet. And if you've ever seen CNN 10, I actually used to use this with my journalism students last year, and they eventually told me, Ms. Gregory, this is just too babyish. We're just not interested in this. It has really nothing to do with CNN. It's definitely focused towards students kind of upbeat and trying to get them interested in the news. And they'll do like funny videos and things around the internet, like cute memes and pictures and stuff. So it's definitely not a source of indoctrination that shouldn't be used in schools. And I'm in a couple of private Facebook educator groups, and I can't remember which one I got this from, but this kind of shows the problem. This person said, I mean, it's propaganda, like all mainstream news. I wouldn't show it. I felt uncomfortable showing Channel 1 news too. So we can tell a lot by this person's first sentence. Calling CNN propaganda, that's a loaded word, of course. And then even the claim that all mainstream news is propaganda. So this is an example of hyper-partisanship, just making very extreme claims like that. And this is what we're dealing with in schools, especially, is trying to educate people and say, let's think about this more, especially because we're trying to use resources with students so that we can educate them. And so this would definitely be something that would not not need to be censored. And so our next example, if you've ever looked in your state's comprehensive health education laws, this one I found the other year and I was really disturbed by it. And this directly spreads disinformation. This is the actual law in South Carolina. The program or instruction provided for in this section may not include a discussion of alternate sexual lifestyles from heterosexual relationships, including but not limited to homosexual relationships, except in the context of instruction concerning sexually transmitted diseases. So obviously this is a law and it's spreading disinformation, that it seems to suggest that if you followed the standard with your students, that you're teaching them that only homosexual relationships result in people catching a sexually transmitted disease, which we know is not true. And so that not only harms groups of people, but it also puts students' health at risk by the suggestion of this claim. And there actually was a lawsuit, I think last year, on this topic. Lambda Legal and the National Center for Lesbian Rights, they, in conjunction with a student, brought a federal lawsuit, which resulted in this directive that the South Carolina State Superintendent of Education, Molly Spearman, she was directed to provide guidance to districts, about how to move forward without enforcing this law. And I haven't really been able to find out anything much about this lately, like where we're at, what we're doing. So if anyone does know, I would love to learn more about that. And, I take a lot of issue with this as well. I think another reason why we need to be sure of what our education laws are, because, we are institutions of learning, and we have a responsibility not to spread disinformation, especially if it negatively affects our students' mental health and their general safety and well-being. So again, this is an interpretation of something that should not be in a law. So this is an example of hyper-partisanship as well. And we can also look at our state education standards. This should be something that's especially school librarians are familiar with as you collaborate with classroom teachers. I hosted a webinar in December with the Intellectual Freedom Roundtable about the recent news in South Dakota of how they completely eliminated Indigenous people from their state education standards. So it's always good to know what the standards are so we can help in the school library supplement students' learning. So in South Carolina, we have new US history standards for our 11th graders, and they do take an end of course exam that is run through the State Department. So if you just look at the wording, you can definitely see some bias in here. So this wording here, encourage inquiry into how Republican ideals help some citizens, though marginalized groups still sought better opportunities and treatment. So we're using the euphemism marginalized groups. And we're talking about how our ideals helped some, but others sought better opportunities instead of using words like enslaved people or kind of getting to the reality of our history. This one is especially telling. We are describing liberty, the blessings of liberty. So not only is that an interpretation of something, but it has a lot of religious connotation to it. And it just shows the state already interpreting a concept for students when it should not do that. And here's just one more example. Encourage inquiry into the causes of American expansion, such as a growing and diversifying population and the expansion of the plantation economy. So again, we're not using the word slavery or enslaved people. We're just calling it the plantation economy, which if you had no idea what that was, sounds sort of innocuous. So getting to know your education standards is really important so that we can help prevent education that is already interpreted for students in a partisan way. And this next one is a big one. We're seeing this all over the place. I know a lot of us have heard of Moms of Liberty. So there's a lot of grassroots organizations popping up in states all over the country. and they are often backed by political groups, and they are pushing for extreme measures in schools and libraries. And this can affect legislation in states too. So while they might be small groups and just really loud, I mean, they can have some power. They can get some things done. So I actually, in early November, I attended a meeting for one of these groups. It's South Carolina Parents Involved in Education, which is a chapter of the national group, United States Parents Involved in Education. This group is holding meetings all across South Carolina. I have been in their Facebook group, which is how I know kind of what they're doing. So when I attended their meeting, it's hard to listen to people criticize your profession, but I think it's also necessary so that we know exactly what these people are arguing and what they are claiming, and then we'll know how to educate them about what we're really doing, what the truth is. So they make a lot of claims, this group and many others similar to USPIE. They're anti-critical race theory. They very much believe that that's what we are teaching students in every single class all the time. They are anti-social emotional learning. They think that that should not be taught in schools at all. And they are also against media and news literacy education, which is probably not surprising. But they did point that out in the meeting I went to. They actually had a slide about the news literacy project. So boiling all of their arguments down, at the basis of it, they claim that all of this promotes Marxism, that we're trying to make everybody the same. And I can read you here some direct quotes of things that the presenter said. They claim that critical race theory bullies white people, that it promotes a victim mentality among people of color. They claim that schools are too focused on social emotional learning instead of academics. They claim that schools won't share social emotional learning lessons because they want to hide what they're doing. They claim that social emotional learning creates social justice warriors by using identity politics. They claim that critical race theory is an intentional agenda to destroy our country, and children are being indoctrinated, and that it is a battle of good versus evil, what they're doing. So just that language right there shows you the hyper-partisanship, the extreme language, good versus evil, that we are indoctrinating students. We want to destroy our country. And so these things they're difficult for us to combat. And I'll show you a few slides here. They pointed out, they took issue with Berea High School. Berea High School won an award for excellence in diversity. And so the presenter showed this picture and said, look at this picture. They have these flags of countries around the world hanging up in their school. And I think it's supposed to be whatever flag is hanging up, there's a student at that school, either from that country or has a background from that country. And they said that the only flag that should be there should be the American flag, because otherwise it promotes divisiveness and doesn't teach students how to be American. They showed this is even more troubling. They showed a list of the Greenville County School Board members, and the check mark indicates that that person attended a Diversity Leadership Institute, and they want those people voted out. So the highlighted names are those who are up for re-election this year. So, and this is their goals list, this last picture. So their ultimate goal is to vote these people out, and I guess ostensibly get their people voted in, and then fire superintendents so they can, basically take over. So a lot of very strong language used, a lot of emotions. They also, in terms of book censorship, an audience member recommended that others call media specialists in Greenville County directly to ask if they have certain books. They have some book list. I don't know what it is. I haven't seen it, but they suggested that. They shared contact information like email addresses and phone numbers for USC School of Education professors who they believe are teaching future teachers about critical race theory, and that was kind of disturbing. They also shared information about Furman University's Riley Institute, and several members in the audience expressed interest in learning how they could dismantle that program. So again, it might seem like, well, these groups are small and it's just that they're really loud, but they can do a lot of damage with their rhetoric because it's really resonating with a lot of people. And as the next slide shows, it can impact legislation. So we know that a lot of states across the country are dealing with just an explosion of basically anti-critical race theory legislation that affects education. So we see in Florida, Wyoming, New Hampshire, Texas, Virginia, Missouri, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. These are among states facing an increase not only in book censorship, but also in legislation targeting public education. So this is often dubbed anti-critical race theory, and these proposed bills often include the same wording, restricting how classroom teachers present issues of race, history, and current events because of the fear that these topics teach students to hate America and feel badly about themselves. So in South Carolina, supposedly, this bill is going to be introduced this month, and the title of it, Freedom from Ideological Coercion and Indoctrination. That gives you some sort of idea of what we're going to read. And these are the representatives who are introducing this bill. So I wanted to show you just part of this real quick, to show you the hyper-partisanship at play that would restrict First Amendment rights. And you can read this first part here. They want us to refrain from judging, stereotyping, or scapegoating others based on personal or group characteristics. So I assume, they're thinking about what they think is critical race theory and judging white people for past history. And there's just a lot to read here, and I wanted just to read the most important part for right now. This right here, an individual must be compelled to affirm, accept, adopt, or adhere to particular language usage or definitions not universally accepted or controversial concepts like the existence of genders other than male or female, non-binary pronouns, unconscious bias, or that race and sex are social constructs. And the two hosts of the SCPIE group directly mentioned that unconscious bias does not exist, that we just say that to further divide ourselves. And this really impacts school libraries and school curriculum. We cannot subject minors under 18 to instruction, presentations, discussions, counseling, or materials in any medium. So that's us, that involve the following controversial and age inappropriate topics: sexual lifestyles, acts, gender identity, and what they call pornographic, lewd, explicit, profane, or similarly age inappropriate materials, which I think is general enough that they're trying to censor school library materials that we know are not pornographic, and they're not lewd, and they're not explicit. So again, this copycat legislation is definitely something to keep an eye on. Some states have already even passed this. And part of our bill in our state in South Carolina is sort of disturbing, that within 30 days of the effective date of this section, the Attorney General would establish a public reporting hotline telephone number and email address for receiving reports of violations. And I believe the idea is that if someone were found to have violated this new law, there would be a loss of funding. And I did email Mike Burns, the representative from Greenville, since I work in Greenville County, and asked him about this. And he claimed that there is a senior in high school who failed a course this year because he refused to write a critical apology paper for being white. And so I further asked him, what was the situation? Can you be more specific? And should you pass a law just based on one incident? And then this is his response: there was tangible proof, the matter has been handled, and he's going to keep the story confidential. So not a lot of information there about their motivations for creating this law. We all are aware of the controversy, unfortunately, surrounding Genderqueer, which is a nonfiction memoir and graphic novel format about the author's journey through gender and sexuality. We know it started in Fort Mill, and the officials there did not follow the selection process or the review process. It was taken out pending review and removed. In Greenville County, what I read in the news was that there was only one copy in the district schools, and Greenville County is a huge school district. And it was removed even though there was no complaint filed, that they just heard of the controversy and went ahead and took it out. So we know that that's not a best practice. That's not lawful. And I wanted to show you this quote in a news article from Tim Waller, who is the director of media relations in Greenville County School District. So this shows our particular struggle. This particular nonfiction memoir was on a list recommended for school libraries by the School Library Journal, which makes it clear to us that the individuals who review books for this source do not share our community's values around what is age appropriate for school-aged children. We are extremely disappointed that the School Library Journal, a publication that should be a reliable resource for our media specialists, recommended this text. So this kind of reminds me of how a lot of people argue now about facts. Because traditionally when people come to us with an issue, we say, well, here's reviews and here are award lists that this book appears on. But when people start to argue with the foundations of parts of our profession, that makes it even more difficult. And last but not least, I have to brag on our wonderful SCASL leadership. So in South Carolina, our governor, Henry McMaster, he got wind of the genderqueer controversy, and he sends a letter to our state superintendent of education, Molly Spearman. He wants her to investigate obscene and pornographic materials in our schools, which we know that book is not pornographic. He asked for an explanation of how this book got in these schools and what she intends to do. He wants them to identify other obscene or pornographic materials and to develop a statewide process to review and approve books. Now, of course, we all notice in this whole scenario, there's no mention of school librarians. It's like he has no idea that we're a profession and that we are in his state. So Spearman did respond to him that she was going to start doing that. And even in her response, she did not mention school librarians. So our ever wonderful SCASL president-elect, Tamara Cox, she initiated a discussion with Spearman's office. And so our SCASL leadership got involved. They met with Molly Spearman and people in her office to share examples of selection policies and to be part of the conversation. They were talking about our whole profession and not including us in the conversation. And so they have been and they continue to be involved as this process evolves. I think at this point, the board is scheduled to vote on whether or not to approve the policy that Molly Spearman is supposed to set forth as a model for our state. They're supposed to vote on that next week. But districts would still be able to use their own policies. This would just be more for reference, I believe. And here's our wonderful picture of our SCASL leadership. Our Intellectual Freedom Committee Chair, Jill Tyner, our President-elect Tamara Cox, and our SCASL President, Catherine Malmquist. So we thank them for their leadership. Okay, so now we want to do something here. We want to go through real quick, what are the court cases that we all should know? And I went a little broad at first about student expression right, our students' First Amendment rights at school, because a lot of these are foundational, and it's very important that we remember these when we face challenges. So what do we think? Can students peacefully protest on school grounds? And you can type in the chat or just think to yourself. And actually, bonus points. Which Supreme Court case does this question allude to? Yes. Yay, yeah. Tinker, we all know Tinker, the black armbands. So it was 3 students who wore black armbands to school and to support peace from the Vietnam War. And of course, we probably all know that they were suspended, and they won at the Supreme Court level. Yes, that's right. This is the famous case where we have the quote, "It can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." So just because you're at school doesn't mean you have very limited First Amendment rights. Okay, can a student use explicit language at a school-sponsored event off school property. And which Supreme Court case is it? I have my cheat sheet. Oh, I lost my chat box. Okay, so this is the Morse v. Frederick case. So this was in 2002 in Alaska. The Olympic torch relay was going to pass through a town in Juneau, Alaska, and it was going to be during school hours. So students and teachers were allowed to go out during the school day to watch the Olympic torch bearer go through the town. And so as they're about to run past this one student with all the media and everything, Joseph Frederick, he unfurls this big banner that says "Bong hits for Jesus." And the museum in Washington, D.C. used to have that on display. I saw that once. It was really cool. So he was suspended, and that actually was upheld because they argued it was reasonable to interpret that sign as being promoting drug use. And because it was during school hours at a school-sponsored event, that he was not permitted to use that language. Can school officials censor school publications? And this, I've been a newspaper advisor, so do we know the court case? So this is Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeyer. So this is in the 80s. And in this court case, the principal took out 2 pages of the student newspaper. One was about students' experiences with pregnancy, and one was about divorce. And his reasoning was that he was worried about revealing identities of the students who had dealt with pregnancy. And he also worried about the divorce article because the parent, it was clear that a student was complaining about the parent from, in the divorce situation, and that person had not been given an opportunity to defend themselves. So this one always counterbalances the tinker. When you read things, they usually go together. So this court case, they said that school-sponsored publications are part of the school curriculum because it's usually a class that you take. And this argued that educators can exercise control over speech so long as their actions are reasonably related to legitimate pedagogical concerns. And our last one, a lot of you already guessed. Can a student be punished for using profanity related to school on social media? Yes, this is the recent one that just happened. So in this case, because she's a minor, they name her BL. She made the junior varsity cheerleading squad instead of varsity. So like I'm sure has happened many times and will happen in the future again, she takes to Snapchat and posts some explicit language, F the school, F softball, F cheer, F everything, and some hand gestures and things. And they suspended her from the team for a year. And she did win this court case. I don't think it was even close. I think it was 8-1. So they argued that what she did not cause substantial disruption or threaten harm to the rights of others. So that seemed pretty clear, I think. Okay, and so the next slide we'll go through here. Oh, these all showed up. I suppose I forgot to make the animation. I'm sorry. That kind of ruins it. Okay, so we all have to know the Island Trees v. Pico case. We have to know this one. It's extremely important. Can a school board remove books from a school library? They cannot if it's because of ideological concern or because of viewpoint discrimination. Okay, so this story is kind of involved, but it starts out like things we've already heard. Some school board members in the community attended a meeting of the group Parents of New York United, which is a conservative partisan group. They came back with a list of objectionable books like Slaughterhouse-Five. And this is the famous quote where they called them anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy. So the board ordered the librarians to bring them the titles. They formed a parent-teacher committee, which recommended removing only 2 of the books on their list, but the board decided on its own to remove 9 books. So 5 students sued. And eventually the Supreme Court rules for the students, but it's a very close 5-4 decision. And this is where we get very famous quotes, and one that's going to sound directly applicable today. It's kind of eerie. School boards exercise legitimate role in determining school library content, but this may not be exercised in a narrowly partisan or political manner. The same conclusion would surely apply if an all-white school board, motivated by racial animus, decided to remove all books authored by Blacks or advocating racial equality or integration. And when I read that, I just stopped immediately because that's what is happening today. We know Matt Krause's list of 850 books in Texas. Most of them have something to do with a minority, a person of color, or sexuality and gender discrimination. So definitely remember PICO. The next one, Case versus United. This has to do with can school boards remove donated library books? And you can look that up. It's the same kind of issue, not if we can prove that they are only doing it because of viewpoint discrimination. Case versus United, that's it, I'm sorry. So the next one I have on here is Sund versus the city of Wichita Falls. And this was actually about a public library that had Heather Has Two Mommies and Daddy's Roommate. And the library had these books legitimately. Obviously, we know these 2 titles. People had even asked them to have the titles. So eventually, a group wanted them removed, and they went to the public library, which kept them. So they go to the city council, and the city council comes up with this idea for a resolution. So they said, okay, if you can get 300 members of the public library who are at least 18 years old to sign this petition, we'll move the books from the children's to the adult section. And so the court ultimately ruled that they could not do that. They could not have a petition to let patrons have that kind of power. And then finally, this one is new. Coble v. Lake Norman Charter School. I encourage you to look at this one. It's about the Poet X. In this case, the parents didn't like that their son in 9th grade was reading the Poet X because they are Catholic. And they argued that the book displayed a negative view of Catholicism and that nobody should have to read it. And the judge wrote some very interesting things on this that we need to remember, that public schools are not obliged to shield individual students from ideas which potentially are religiously offensive. There is no, and we talked about that at the beginning of the presentation, there's no way we can guarantee that everything you read you're going to agree with or won't offend you. And this quote at the bottom is from Stephen Pico, actually, from the Pico Supreme Court case. And this is very true today, too. The bottom line is that no one, let me see my notes. No one in the Island Trees community ever complained about any of these books. Members of the Island Trees Board of Education found a list of objectionable books on a table at a conference that was being held in another part of the state. Then they returned to our community and searched our public school system for these titles. Why were so many books discussing the experiences of minority groups in the US on that original list? And that's kind of chilling as well, because that's exactly what we've already talked about tonight, happening again. So I just wanted to remind everybody that our National School Library Standards share our common beliefs as a profession. And of course, we know that number 5 directly states that intellectual freedom is every learner's right. And really, none of this can happen without intellectual freedom. You can't have inquiry. You can't spark curiosity if you're also very narrowly and in a hyper-partisan way restricting what they can even encounter in terms of information. And this is a very striking quote in our National School Library Standards book as well. Not everything a learner hears will be accurate or beneficial. So honing critical and analytical skills is crucial to growth as an informed global citizen. So we can't shy away from controversy. And this is really tough too, because a lot of people are nervous, they're scared for their jobs, they don't want to make people angry. But our job is not to make sure that they never see anything that is potentially controversial. That cannot happen. It's not realistic and it's not constitutional. And just to share with you, there are some of our National School Library Standards that directly involve intellectual freedom, including school librarian behaviors, that we advocate and model respect for diverse perspectives, and that we provide opportunities for learners to interact with others who offer a range of perspectives. And you can also look in your state standards, and South Carolina state standards are some of our English standards directly reflect our library ideals as well. And this directly conflicts with the new legislation that's being introduced. How can you evaluate perspectives of what you're reading if you aren't allowed to access a wide variety of perspectives? You have to be able to do that. And that is well within a reasonable expectation in education to do this with students. And also remember Article 5 of the Bill of Rights, and we also have the minors' rights to read from ALA, that we do not restrict access to information just simply because of age. And again, this goes back to the idea that we can't prevent people from accessing information just because it might not be appropriate for them. They are the best judge of that, and we are not the students' parents. And so we operate under a more broad range than a narrowly tailored one. So the answer is always awareness and action. So when we provide physical access to information, when we remove all of the barriers, when we focus on equity of access, we foster this awareness of intellectual freedom rights. And so this makes people aware of what is intellectual freedom and what is its place in an American democracy. So let me share real quick some things I've done in my classroom, in my library. I've had students research book censorship themselves. In my experience, I love presenting during Banned Books Week. I enjoy doing that in September because it kind of sets the tone for the whole year. We talk about the basis of intellectual freedom right at the beginning of the year. And I usually call it the Freedom to Read Week. You can do a lot of things here. I've had students role play. So get that challenge form out of your selection policy and have students look at a book and role play. Would you defend this? What would you say if you don't defend it, if you think it's inappropriate? Oh, I don't think I meant to do that, but we'll look at that. Let's see. I had one class do a mock school board meeting. So if you want to go that far, and they can practice role playing, but in the context of, okay, you're a stakeholder as the board member, you're a stakeholder as a parent, you're a stakeholder as a teacher, you're a stakeholder as a librarian. What would you all argue? So they get to take on other people's perspectives that way as well, which encourages intellectual freedom. You always got to go to Gail of opposing viewpoints. I mean, I'm in love with Gail. A lot of us are. Let's see if this will work. There is a topics page on book banning, so they can get into some nitty gritty stuff here, and we know it's good research. And I used to do this in my classroom when I was an English teacher. I would have students, we did a whole book censorship unit, and they would pick a book that had been challenged or even banned in history. Hi, Teresa, that's for you. And I would have them keep a chart of objectionable scenes, and then they would also write down their reflection on the scene and whether or not they thought it was appropriate or whatever. They had to do some research on the book, why it was challenged. And I eventually had them do a Google site. Well, actually, I'm sorry. This is back in the day. We did a class wiki page. So every student had a page on the class wiki where they shared all of their research about their book. And it was great. I've also used live binders that way. So that's really fun. And this is the digital escape room that I accidentally clicked on before. This is just to kind of gamify, I guess, make it fun in a way. And the clues I have embedded on objects hidden in this homepage here. So here's a lock, and they had to find the answers to these. So that's a great way to build awareness in a non-threatening way. I love to do bulletin boards. Those are really easy, and you can have a permanent display, I do, of the top challenged books for the year. I also have a framed copy of the Freedom to Read statement and the Library Bill of Rights. So Lift the Flap can be these court cases maybe, and then you have it there for patrons to interact with. I've had success with students researching court cases, and it just depends on your students, of course, you know them, or your patrons. But here's an example of a shared Google Doc where they had to read a little bit about the court case and then type in some of their thoughts. Did they agree or disagree with it? So they got to do some interaction there. Show pictures. They love, in my experience, the students love learning about the Bong Hits for Jesus case. Teach them how to write editorials, letters to the editor, to representatives, and you're not telling them what to write, you're just showing them how they can do it. And so that's how we can hopefully alleviate some fears people have about indoctrination. We're not telling them what to write, we're just showing them this is how you participate in democracy. I love Four Corners activities. My journalism students just did this while I was at AASL in Salt Lake City this past fall. I give them a claim. So this is an opinion statement. And then it's four corners. So they did this as a shared Google Doc. They have to pretend that they strongly agree with the claim and write a statement that shows that. And then there's somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. And you can do this as four corners. I also have strongly agree as a sign. So all four of those positions as signs, and then they just go to a corner of the room, depending on whatever claim you read. I've done that featuring statements about book censorship, and they really get into it because when I do this with students, they really have never heard of book censorship before. So they learn a lot of new things. You can do station work. I've used guided questions at stations. Questions like, should books include offensive words? How is society affected when certain groups are denied an education? Should schools regulate or monitor student speech on social media off campus? Is society harmed when profanity is allowed to remain in music lyrics? So there's a lot of interesting questions you can have them. And when they're at stations, they can do a little bit of research to answer the questions. So that's a great way to educate people about intellectual freedom. I love to do trivia questions. That also makes it more fun and it's easy to do. And please don't forget, there is a Freedom to Read Foundation grant, the Judith F. Krug grant. I got that one year, and with the money, I purchased copies of books like Mexican White Boy, All American Boys, The Hate You Give, and students did book clubs and researched the books. Some of those books have been challenged in South Carolina, so that was kind of the context. And that top picture there, one of my AP language classes, I was the AP language teacher a long time ago. And one year they really got into the court case, the Tinker case. And you can see there, we made black armbands and they wore them with the day that was the anniversary of the decision upholding their rights. And I used to have my AP language students do a First Amendment research project. And there's lots of ways you can do that too. That's really fun. So to end, I just want to give some advice. None of us are in these situations because we've done something wrong, and they are very difficult to navigate. And so if you feel like you're just spinning your wheels, just know that we're all in this together. So I would suggest there are lots of templates out on the internet for responding to censors, especially school board members or state legislator representatives. So use those, email people and call them on the phone. And when you're respectful in your tone, there isn't anything to be afraid of. And really, you have to get your students involved because this is their education that's being affected. This is their access to books and to information that we know that they need. These are their lived experiences. So we have to show them, how do you call your state representative? How do you write an email to them? What are you supposed to do? And again, we're not telling them what to say. We're just saying, if this is something you care about, let me show you how to be an active participant in a democratic society. I feel like we could embed freedom to read ideas into our literacy nights that we do with parents. And this would look different for every school, of course, but part of it is demystifying the library process. And this is a hurdle for us anyway, getting people to understand who we are and what we do, and that it's not indoctrination, but it's the exact opposite. We're trying to ensure their freedom. We do this anyway, but just building relationships as well, so that if something happens, people know that you are trustworthy. Don't be afraid to try to incorporate the First Amendment into a variety of subject areas. Art censorship is a great topic, of course, science and social studies. And again, just a reminder to be strong but steadfast and take people's worries seriously, but also at the same time, we have our foundational ideals of our profession that are tried and true. We know what's been through the courts, and we know how to support students' rights. And I just wanted to say, I get a lot of information from this book, We the Students. This is written by an actual Maryland representative, Jamie Raskin. I've used this book even when I was a classroom teacher. And ironically, this is one of the books on Matt Krause's list that should be removed. So, okay, that was a lot of information. Are we ready to go to questions?
Yes, thank you, Jamie. That was great. And those are really terrific ideas to include students in the conversation. We have just a couple of